the recent episode on the 1926 census was, perhaps unsurprisingly, amongst the most popular episodes of the podcast to date. And I think that was testament to the level of public excitement around the then forthcoming release. Nostradamus here made a few predictions on what might be in it, some of which was proven right, but like everybody, there was plenty that surprised me in the eventual release. It now seems a good time to go back to that subject, and who better to join me than John Gibney, because he is the co-editor of The Story of Us, Independent Ireland and the 1926 Census, along with Orla MacBride of the National Archives of Ireland. Now, John doesn't work for the National Archives of Ireland. His day job is with the Royal Irish Academy, and he's not only a friend and a brilliant historian. His survey history of Ireland has been a constant bestseller over recent years, but he's also a great editor. I've been lucky enough in the past, actually, to have John as an editor. And The Story of Us, unsurprisingly, has been a massive chart hit. It's been a very healthy few months for Irish history books in general in the charts, but The Story of Us is doing really, really well. So on a roasting day in Stephen's Green, my place of choice, normally if I do a podcast outside, we do it at the W.B. Yeats Memorial, was occupied by young fellas with the speaker blaring tunes, and who could blame them with the weather we've been having? We instead made for the bench by the James Joyce Memorial. And that bench, if you don't know it, is worth seeking out. It's facing the bust of Joyce, almost head on, and includes a dedication to him and his beloved but troubled father, John Stanislaus Joyce. In the 1926 census, Joyce's father can be found living in digs, essentially, in Drumcondra, by then a retired widower. He was now a lodger. An American writer who came to visit him in 1925 wrote that, "I've never seen a more intense face than that of old man Joyce. The old man was staying in a typical boarding house of the type I had known in New York in other years. The landlady was a none too cleanly, good-natured and rather shiftless Irish woman who complained about the trouble and work the old man caused her, but she appeared to like his presence in the house." And moments like that, where you're sitting on the bench with his name on it and you think, God, I must look him up in the census. I think that kind of moment will probably keep happening for weeks and months ahead. So this is a chat with the co-editor of the new book on the census, but it's got some nice personal reflections and observations in it too. I'll talk a little about how I'm using the census and work in 14 Henrietta Street and my own family in it, but for now, enjoy this edition. One of the great things about a census now and then is that we get the hard data early on. We get the big picture, we get a sense of how many people. But it's the more personal information that is strictly held through generations. And what that means, of course, is there are no big surprises. We already knew how many people were living in Ireland or in the 26 counties within the census in 1926. The larger picture of society demographically is there. And The Story of Us, I think, has resonated hugely with people because it is, at its core, a social history. The contextualization of the time, sport and its place in our lives, the reconstruction of the country physically in the aftermath of revolution, what was happening on the literal day of the census. For me, it's a book that is at its best when it gets into the census returns themselves.
The book is called The Story of Us, Independent Ireland and the 1926 Census, co-edited by myself and Orla MacBride, the director of the National Archives. And it is, without doubt, the finest book ever written about Ireland in 1926, and will withstand competition on that basis. A national bestseller, so we get the comments of a best-selling editor, not a best-selling author. And the idea was to create a book that kind of conjures up the world of the census, because, like I said earlier on, Donald, we're going to be looking at, say, where people lived. It might be the house that we live in, or a house that we know, or an ancestor. But the idea of the book is give a sense of what kind of world was it meant to be. And we kind of thought, try and put the politics out of it. Look at the social history. I mean, political history is well served in this country. So we get that out of the way in the introduction. And then it's basically a sequence of short chapters. They're all about 12 to 1400 words long. I mean, the idea, I suppose, was it's meant to be accessible, but hopefully people will finish reading a chapter before they get bored of it, So you'd have, they cover various themes and localities, but we did, there's chapters on, say, like entertainment and social life in the Ireland of the 1920s. What did the census discover, and how was the census brought into being? How did it actually operate in practice? What did buildings look like? What was the physical environment? There's a very good piece by Ellen Rowley about that, and that's applicable that has a relevance to Dublin as well. Like all of it has, you can take an idea from say Paul Rouse's chapter on entertainment and think about applying that to the history of Dublin. And there's then a sequence of chapters that deal with small micro studies, so using a very small number of census forms in each case to which authors are given access to ahead of time, subject to confidentiality agreements. And they kind of conjure up kind of little micro histories of slices of Irish life. And some of them do deal with Dublin, like you mentioned Power Gates as a chapter. Ida Milne has one as well. And they both create micro histories of two distinct Dublin tenements.
So yes, 2 entries on Dublin tenements. 16 Dig Street Upper, which is near St. Stephen's Green, and Ainger Street, now totally transformed, is explored by Pádraig Yates. Pádraig was the author of a brilliant history of the 1913 lockout, and he's written books on Dublin right through the revolution. And he notes that by 1926, none of the residents at number 16 who had been recorded in 1911 still resided there. Almost all the residents in that tenement were native Dubliners. Only 2 families originated outside of the capital. The historian Ida Milne looks at 34 Marlborough Street in the north inner city, but right there by the Liffey. There are 2 families still resident since 1911. In the house were builders' labourers, a worker with the Dublin United Tramway Company, domestic servants, and times were tough. 29 people lived in number 34. But for me, working where I do, I was drawn to 14 Henrietta Street. And the picture there was really, really grim. Unemployment was rife. The family of the executed Republican Thomas Bryan, who was one of the forgotten 10, given a full state funeral and reburial in 2001. Even though they'd lost a son in the War of Independence, they were living in just really bad conditions. His 64-year-old father writes on the form, out of work for 9 months under occupation. And what struck me about Henrietta Street, by comparison to the 2 tenement examples in the book, was just the extraordinary high level of unemployment amongst the men on the street. And it would seem to me on Henrietta Street, women fared a little bit better. For example, Williams and Wood's jam factory, you can almost see, or you could see, Williams and Wood's from the end of the street. And it's interesting too that in number 14, you'd struggle to find a single Irish speaker. There are other parts of Dublin's tenement landscape that are interesting. I mean, the closure of the Monto, as the red light district had come to be known, that completely transformed some streets. Take Foley Street, previously Montgomery Street, where you no longer have those households that you find in the earlier census returns, lots of unrelated women, but now families living in their place. And on getting access to the census on the night that we all did, I think we all, didn't we? We went looking for our own family. In Cornmarket, the same address given by my great-grandfather before he went off to war with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, my great-granny, Ellen Howard, was now head of household at 38 years of age. Married, is struck through, replaced by widow. Her husband had made it back from the front, physically, if not mentally, and we know he made it back. I mean, the birth of my grandmother, just 6 at the time, is there in the document. But he would die in the Richmond on a ward full of broken men from the old toughs, as the Fusiliers were known. It was an emotional experience to see that return and to imagine that 38-year-old woman with so much now on her shoulders. I never met my grandmother on my mother's side, who lived a short life. But as John points out, there is something extraordinary in seeing those that we did know, people we knew at the very end of their lives. But there they are in their own parents' handwriting, if their parents could read and write, at the very beginning of their lives. And that can bring us on an amazing journey.
And it is quite striking to see. Now, I didn't know my grandparents, at least not on my paternal side. I have a vague memory of my grandmother, my father's mother, but his father, he died before I was born. But there's people on both forms whom I did know. My father's great aunts, and these are people I remember them. I remember going to their funerals, and there I am seeing them as young girls in black and white. And you do start to see things that make you wonder.
And for many, there's a question mark and not a full stop, perhaps, in what they find in this census. But we are all, and it's a great term, and John gets into what it means, roots hunters. In a sense, this journey is one into the immediate history of our lives.
All we're left with the census, as with many other documents, and I'm going to quote the late David Fitzpatrick on this, who wrote a very fascinating book about Irish emigrants to Australia and the correspondence they wrote back. But he referred to, route hunters looking for the desiccated fragments of the past. And he meant that in quite an affectionate and empathetic way. That's all we have to go on. We can't fill in the gaps, but it's tempting to speculate. And I think that's, there is a kind of, there's an emotional resonance to looking at a census form because, we're all looking for something, and we're curious about what's immediate to us.
Before we start getting into things like migration and the language and the revolutionary generation and the individual census returns, it seems a good point to get John to give a kind of broad overview of just why the census was so important and what it tells us. And when people are so worried about population decline, actually in Dublin, as John makes the point, the population was going up.
I mean, the first Irish census was the first census we'd recognise now was 1821. Obviously, there have been attempts to collate information about the population for centuries beforehand. But the model of the census really kind of picked off in 1841. And the way in which it was administered was basically the police officers, the RAC, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, they gave out the forms and they picked them up. Now, it's obviously not the case these days, but that's how it was done. Police would have local knowledge, they knew how to get around, so on and so forth. Now, in 1921, it wasn't really a good idea for the Royal Irish Constabulary or the Dublin Metropolitan Police to be knocking on doors looking for information. I mean, the police forces, especially the RIC, were targeted by the IRA, as a kind of quasi-paramilitary force that was hated by Republicans. They were targeted explicitly. So it was just too dangerous to carry out a census. And that's even before you get to the possibility that there might have been some kind of attempts to boycott it, administrative disruption. I mean, we know that suffragettes and suffragists would have boycotted earlier censuses as well. Republicans may well have done the same, but, the Dáil had an alternative government and an alternative administration. So not only would it have been dangerous for police officers, it's the fact that this would have been seen as a British census. So it was cancelled in 1921, despite the fact that it took place in the rest of the United Kingdom. Because whether we like it or not, in 1921, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. That didn't last for most of the island, but that was the administrative reality. So 21 census for Great Britain, nothing for the island of Ireland. And then 5 years after, you had the two censuses conducted in tandem. Now, thing to say is that the 6 county census no longer or at least the returns no longer exist. The 26 county census of the Irish Free State does exist, and it was kind of, I suppose, seen by the Free State, and it was a sense was articulated that this was another attempt at the state kind of stepping up to the mark, a new state stepping up into the limelight. Now, you can over-egg that in a kind of politicised sense, but people at W.T. Cosgrave and his cohorts and members of the pro-treaty side, the Cumann na Gael administration, and the civil service that they administered as well, there was a definite sense among part of them, even though very often this was a strong strain of social conservatism, there was a definite sense that many of them had that they were going to make this Free State work, come what may, in a way that they saw fit, but that it would be something that would function. And the census was seen as it was given almost a symbolic value, it was kind of proof that the Free State itself could function, despite what many British propagandists would have claimed about the future prospect of Irish self-government, as well as being an accounting of that state just after the revolutionary period. And that's what gives the significance to the census. We're used to 5-year censuses now, or a 5-year gap between them. Back then it was 10 years. 15 is unusually long. And if you look at the general report of the census, and they've been available from the 1920s, the statistical information that was collected by the census, all of which is kind of available to download from the Central Statistics Office. The census reports do point to extraordinary events that took place between 1911 and 1926. The impact of the First World War and its demographic impact. Revolution in Ireland, as widely defined. One of the great consequences of the revolution that sometimes gets forgotten about, and I think didn't get enough credit or examination during the decade of centenary, which was the withdrawal of the British garrison and their dependents, the disbanding of the RIC. And last but not least, because it's not all about politics necessarily, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. So there have been a succession of extraordinary events that led to a decline in the population of about 5.3%, 168,000 of the population would decline the Free State. Now, there were exceptions. And with this lovingly curated scrap of paper, I'm going to try and give you some sense of what they were. The population of Dublin would have actually increased by 5.2% since 1911. And by Dublin, you don't just mean the city. You'd mean the city and its surrounding townships, Rathgar, Rathmines and so forth, And Dublin, and when I say Dublin, that's what I mean. The metropolitan area with its various local authorities, that was 14.1% of a population of, just under 3 million. So 418,981 people lived in what was then the Greater Dublin area. 61% of the total population lived outside towns or villages across the Free State. 7.7 lived outside towns or villages more than 10,000. But then you've over 14% of that population living in Dublin. So those figures show you just the extent to which, Ireland was a rural country, the Free State was a rural society. But Dublin's urbanisation was kind of out there in a league of its own. And it was dominant across many employment categories. Like say, you might have 2/3 of the coal miners in the country in County Kilkenny, but 3/4 of all people working in tobacco factories were in Dublin.
So where have the headlines gone on this census? I mean, one of the big things the press seemed to pick up on was the relative absence of Irish language returns. About 1% of forms returned in Irish. There are some beautiful examples of Irish language returns written in kind of Clog Gaelic, around the country. In parts of the west of Ireland, Gaeilge One or Irish only can be found under languages. At Herbert Place in Dublin, you'll find young Brian O'Neill, who achieved world fame as Flann O'Brien in a very busy entry form from his family, Gaeilge agus Berla Acu. People were surprised in the press to hear only 1% of returns were filled in as Gaeilge. And so is John, but he puts really important, broader context on the Irish language situation. It's not as grim as some have made out.
About 18% of the population said you could speak Irish. Now, that's an increase from the historic low of 15% in 1891. Now, you factor in, the cultural revival and so forth, and you might think, right, only 3% more speaking Irish, Yeah, but bear in mind, one thing that constantly whittled away at the Irish population was emigration, and that was particularly pronounced in Gaeltacht areas. So you could make a case that, right, well, 15% of the population Irish speakers, predominantly in the Gaeltacht, that would have been increasing or decreasing anyway, but there's a national increase of 3%. And in Dublin, you had an increase of Irish speakers by over 50%. In 1911, there were 11,870 Irish speakers enumerated in the city. That increased to 23,712 15 years later. Now, when they say Irish speakers, people who claim to speak Irish, it's not a testament to absolute fluency, but it does speak to people who are, maybe everyone, you can't say 12,000 people are spoofing, or chancing their arm. It does show, I suppose, maybe a confidence of people saying, well, actually, I do have a bit of proficiency in Irish. Enough to be able to say that, yeah, that's a language I speak, and that got recorded in the census as well. Yeah. Now, an interesting thing about the Irish language returns is that even though, one possibility is that, well, when you see the returns, you kind of see their physical texture as well. And it's quite striking how some people would actually try and write out Clog Gaelic very painstakingly and beautifully. Spellings would vary because they hadn't been fully standardised at that stage. You get the occasional protest as well. There's a couple of people going Irish is a rotten language. Why are we wasting money on it? Sometimes these people may come from affluent areas of South Dublin. Not that I'm casting aspersions on anyone on the basis of their geographical origins. But it is there. And, very often it seems that in Gaeltacht areas, the census enumerators, the Gardaí, would have been filling in the forms as Gaeilge, which might say something about literacy in Gaeltacht areas for monoglot Irish speakers. Fluency in the language didn't necessarily mean literacy in Irish or English for an older generation as well. So the thing, the physicality of the forms poses questions that people can be, you can have the raw data, just like the percentage and all that, but when you see it, when you see what's written, the relationship within a family, or how it was spelled, and even who wrote the form and filled it out, or sometimes surreptitiously corrected it after the fact, as occasionally members of the Gardaí were prone to do. There's the texture of the individual forms themselves tells you something. And going back to the whole thing about the statistics and facts and figures, they rest upon those forms, but they were filled out by human hands, and they reflect human lives.
One area of the census John has looked at is around migration, something that interested me too. And again, we go back to places in our own lives. I mean, for a while, if you've been here for a while, you'd know that we lived for a period around the Black Pits, beside the South Circular Road. So I've always been interested in that part of the city, what was known once upon a time as Little Jerusalem. And when we go in there, we can find, for example, the Herzog family in the entry for the Portobello section of the road. Rabbi Isaac Herzog listed as able to speak and write in the Irish language, and his son, later the President of Israel, appears as a 7-year-old. John looked at Pearse Street, a street which is a brilliant microcosm of so much because it's such a long street. I mean, even in the Three Castles Burning book, when I picked 12 streets, I kind of looked at half of Pearse Street for a reason. And from its solicitors and its clerks and its policemen at one end of it to the more industrial part of it that flows into Ringsend. But the world was there too, with migrant-run businesses. And I asked him, was he surprised at all by the picture painted there?
Surprised, no. And then again, neither were people in 1926 because the foreign-born population of the Free State wasn't unusual compared to many of its European peers. I mean, people moved around and, especially in the aftermath of the Great War, there would have been some dislocation as well, I suppose. What struck me about Pearse Street, and I'm trying to do a bit more research into Pearse Street, it actually came not from the census, but from Tom's directory. Because if you look at Tom's directory, if you look at Pearse Street, you can see all human life is there. And the reason I zoned in on Pearse Street, or why that caught my eye, is that it begins, if you look at the census returns of Pearse Street, it begins at a police barracks. Police detectives enumerated in the police station at one end of it. And then it stretches all the way out to Ringsend and to the docks. And at the city end of it, one thing you notice in Tom's directory is solicitors' firms where the actual home address is given as somewhere like Pembroke Road or Clontarf. And then the amount of businesses that would have been there at the time. You get, there's cinemas, there's obviously it gets a lot more industrial as the further down the Ringsend you get, and also poor. There's more tenements that you notice in Tom's directory. So you can take that and then start linking it up to the farms, and you get eye-catching things. Say the Servi family, Italian immigrants who ran an ice cream parlour. There's a rabbi, there's a music teachers, there's an incredible variety of human life there. And sometimes you get kind of, one detail from Pearse Street that struck me was a fella he marked his religion down in the form as mystical body of Christ. And then you get internal migration as well. People moving from the country to the city, of which there would have been a great deal. Occasionally you do get messages written on the forms. There's one very, very, it's an upsetting thing in its own way, but a fellow who was a gardener living in Pearse Street basically writes down that he's no job, he's no prospect, he doesn't know what he's going to do. And it's like a cry in the dark looking for help, coming to us over a century later. And and now I say Pearse Street, but you could try that with many, many streets in the city. It's not unusual that you might have immigrants in a city because, an urban area has its own centre of gravity. But one thing about the immigrant population of Free State is that they could be found across the state. Like say, there were 3,000 people living in Cavan Town, 9 of them were born overseas. So there was every occupational category, every town or village would have had someone born somewhere else living in it, but you're going to have a higher proportion within the cities itself. And even of the just over 67,000 immigrants to be found in the Free State, over 20,000 of them were in Dublin. So that shows you how it's skewed towards an urban audience. Now, a lot of them would have been British, Scottish, English, Welsh. That was bound to happen given that we hadn't been out that long out of the UK. The economies were still so interrelated. But that's a lot of people. And, that's 20,000 people out of a city of 418,000. So you'd notice the presence, especially if businesses were involved. If you were working on Pearse Street, you're going to notice that ice cream parlour run by the Servis. So, yeah, it's one thread of Irish life, but one that I kind of thought fascinating because you're going to wonder, who are these characters? And then you wonder how did they end up here? And there's one census return from a fella from Rome who was a fish and chip dealer on his own account in Limerick, and he was born in Rome. The wife was born in London, and the daughter was born in Belfast. So there's a story of a family moving around, and the census can tell you those kind of stories, or it gives you enough dots. Maybe not enough to join the dots, but enough to put the dots in a particular order, pointing in a particular direction, if you know what I mean.
Of course, the revolutionary generation are something people would seek out as well. Who is there, who isn't there? And I wondered on the last episode about the census if there would be a sort of Republican boycott of it. The suffragette boycott of 1911, for example, was quite successful across Britain and Ireland. Actually, you'll find some people who boycotted the 1911 census in this one. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, for example, whose husband was murdered in 1916. She's missing in 1911, but she's in this a widow. We find staunch Republicans like her throughout. So, for example, Mary McSweeney, Republican TD, the sister of Terence McSweeney, the martyred Lord Mayor of Cork. She fills out her census entirely as Gaeilge, but then insists that she's only giving the information provided on the orders of the Republican government. In other words, she's making it very clear that she doesn't recognise the Free State, but she's been told to do it. In Herbert Place, 2 female Republican veterans were living together in an apartment. Dorothy Macardle had been a cellmate with Rosamond Jacob during the Civil War, but now they weren't cellmates, they were housemates. And Jacob from a Quaker background in Waterford and Macardle from Dundalk, they gave a really interesting form for a completely unexpected reason. In religion, Macardle lists herself as free thinker. Jacob noted, belongs to no religious sect. Macardle was a founding member of Fianna Fáil and would write The Irish Republic, which was very much the De Valerian history of the revolution. Jacob remained a political radical on the left right through the 1930s. When anti-communism was at its height, she even travelled to the Soviet Union with the Friends of the Soviet Union. Some humour made its way, of course, into the earlier 1911 census, even from people that were very serious about their politics. Sean McDermott, signatory of the proclamation, listed his religion as Nashuntach Nahéireann, or Irish nationalism. But looking through some high-profile 1926 returns, we find the veteran activist Maud Gonne MacBride, of course, her estranged husband, Major John MacBride, executed in 1916, and she listed her occupation as Jack of all trades. Now, unsurprisingly, that was struck out. But in South Dublin, as John notes, there are two entries that really make us think about how radically the lives of these people could change in a short period of time. A political outsider, someone who was kind of in the cold at this time, but destined for massive things, and a political titan destined for a horrific end.
They pop up in the book and the exhibition, and they are respectively Kevin O'Higgins and Eamon de Valera, both of whom resident in South Dublin on the night of the 18th of April 1926 when they filled out their forms. And O'Higgins was at that time the Cumann na Gael Minister for Justice, number 2 to W.T. Cosgrave. Interestingly enough, enumerated in his household was another Cumann na Gael Minister, Patrick Hogan, a close friend of his, who was staying with him that night. They had government meetings that week. De Valera and his family would have filled out their form as Gaeilge. And in the way you look at them, and it's kind of striking. It's you can't look at them without thinking of what of the lives that lie outside it. Like in 1926, Kevin O'Higgins was kind of reaching the pinnacle of his career. Eamon de Valera was kind of hitting one of his nadirs. You know, he had just left. He had just resigned from Sinn Féin. He had just set up this new fledgling political party called Fianna Fáil that may or may not have become a big thing over time. And O'Higgins would have been kind of top of the world of the Free State, you might say. Now, on the 18th of April 1926, you've no inkling that Eamon de Valera would retire from public life 50 years later, and Kevin O'Higgins would have been shot dead 15 months later.
There is more to come with this census, more data, more ways to search it. But as John rightly emphasises, the initial job was just get it up online. This was a brilliant initiative. It didn't crash on the day, as many people expected it to, under the sheer volume of views. And it's a people's resource in the truest sense. I think it's extraordinary that it's free to access, not just here, but everywhere. And of course, in the nature of such things, the work will go on. And it's a people's project also in the sense that there is the means to correct and amend it if needed.
Yeah, my understanding is that the search categories are going to be expanded. I mean, I suppose first things first, the structure was put in place, have a good website that durable website, an easy to use website, and the National Archives have pulled off a brilliant job there. You know, I mean, it got some of the 20 million hits in the first weekend. You know, that's and it withstood that pressure. And long may that continue. So the plan is, as you'll already see in the website, if you look at it, there's a map feature that gives you kind of demographic breakdowns around the country. And the plan is to kind of increase the functionality of the search functions, you know, to make it easier to, that's my understanding, you know, anyway, that say you might be able to search by employer, for example, or house number and so on and so forth. I'm not sure the precise details, but this is the foundation. The plan is to expand the range of things one can do with it, you know. And obviously, you know, if, you know, there's going to be errors in transcription. It's inevitable. It's such a vast job. They'll be corrected as people if people spot them. There's a facility in the National Archives website. I know they work for the National Archives, so I'm not speaking for them, but there is a facility to correct all this. You know, I work for the Royal Irish Academy, but don't work for the National Archives. But they are colleagues and they've done a fantastic job. And when you see the amount of work that went on behind the scenes to pull that together, like conservation, digitization, like a massive effort to put, like, people, I mean, I think sometimes historians, you know, are as guilty of as anyone of not quite seeing the work that lies behind this kind of stuff, you know.
How true that is. On a personal level, a sincere thank you to everyone at the National Archives of Ireland for their work on this project. I think they've done a great service, not only in getting this up online, but in helping to communicate what is in it to the Irish public. And the exhibition, The Story of Us, which coincides with the book, of course, runs at Dublin Castle until the 14th of June 2026. Now, you might be thinking that's not a long time to go and see the thing. Yes, that's a sharp closing date with the EU presidency. Now, it will return, but if you want to see it, move quickly. And it strikes me that, from the brilliant Silk Road Cafe, which I just love, to the stable rooms, the exhibition rooms at the back of Dublin Castle, that EU presidency is really going to make a mark on our day-to-day lives. But I hope that episode encourages you to get in and have a look at it. Friends, thank you as ever so much for tuning in to this edition. Thanks to all of you on Patreon. Thanks also to those of you who left reviews and ratings on the various apps. I said that on the last show, Apple, Spotify, etc. And I've already seen a direct boost actually in plays that comes from that, as I said before, the bloody algorithms. So I see the Pope is now at war with AI. He might democratize the internet yet. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back soon. Much more on the way, including, believe it or not, a chat with Sabina Higgins, all about the Focus Theatre.